This episode is proudly supported by Pepe Sayer Australian Cultured Butter.
The Pepe Sayer all new Australian butter sheets. Everything we've learned over the last 12 years, we've put into making this new butter sheet. Combined with a brand spanking new shiny machine from Switzerland, we're able now to produce this beautiful butter sheet that's so easy to laminate with. So it's pliable, it's very fresh. If you're an Australian baker buying our butter sheets, they're made weekly. The formulation, it's a beautiful unsalted butter that will work for savoury and sweet. I think it's a perfect balance there. The bakers and pastry chefs that are using it are just raving about it.
For more information, go to pepesayer.com.au.
A high street should be an authentic kaleidoscope of the community who live there. We need less international chains and more authentic expressions of community, basically. And that's what people resonate with.
Hey everybody, it is Dani Valent here with you for Dirty Linen Podcast. I am so happy to be here on the mic for what I reckon is going to be a really great chat with James Thorpe. James is the CEO and director of Odd Culture Group in Sydney. I think we're going to have a conversation about big picture stuff, get into some detail and nitty gritty, and really dig into some of the big thoughts around hospitality, drinking culture and the nighttime economy with a Sydney lens. But I think the stuff we're going to talk about will be relevant internationally. James, welcome to Dirty Linen.
Thanks so much for having me, Dani.
Really good to have a chat. I want to start by talking about a really interesting summit that you attended recently, all the way on the other side of the world in Birmingham, UK. Tell us about the Nighttime Economy Summit.
Yeah, so I travelled. I've just gotten back, actually. It's my first week back, just soaking in the Sydney sun again. After being in freezing cold Europe for 5 weeks, I travelled over to the Nighttime Industries Association summit, which was a summit of over 2,000 nightclub owners, nighttime stakeholders, government officials, nightmares, et cetera, to just sort of discuss the state of play and current issues facing operators. Obviously, cost of living and drinking habits in Gen Z were sort of like the two primary things which we hear a lot about, at a high level over here as well. But the thing that sort of struck me the most was just how in a city where, I started my hospitality career just as the lockouts were declared in Sydney, and working and learning in that environment, and seeing the devastation that those laws caused for our sort of what we're now using the rather nebulous term vibrancy to describe, seeing coming from that shared history and seeing the devastation to now a situation where in essentially two law reform packages, being the two vibrancy reforms that the New South Wales government have passed, to now New South Wales being an international case study in how to get this stuff right, was really surprising and shocking to realise. I guess during COVID, we've all sort of had our heads down and kind of siloed ourselves, and we're just grinding through week to week. But to realise sort of how much progress we've made on a legislative front was really, really exciting in comparison to other places in the world.
That's, so interesting. So for people who don't know about the Sydney lockout laws, and correct me where I go wrong, James, but they were a set of laws basically around restricting alcohol sales, purportedly to reduce alcohol-related violence. But what it meant was that there were, I think it was 1:30 a.m. lockouts and 3 a.m. last drinks in bars, pubs and clubs in Sydney, just in the central city area, I think. And they ran for 6 or 7 years, ending sometime during the COVID period. Is that sort of what we're talking about? Yeah,
that's right. And what the government's been able to tackle since then is also a set of sort of ancillary, antiquated conditions, like our liquor licensing system in New South Wales is very unusual. Sydney as a city started as a pub and a church and sort of spiraled outwards. That's why our roads in the city don't make any sense. And we have a lot of pubs and large format venues, and that's like our history with our licensing system. The influence of conservative Christianity within the New South Wales government historically has meant that there have been lots of sort of like fun police elements to our laws, like, the stuff that the Premier and Minister Graham say a lot about, like bans on mirror balls, bans on styles of music being played, and of course the lockouts themselves stopped entry after 1:30 a.m. in the main entertainment district of the city, which had, about the expected reaction and devastation on not just like licensed premises who have closed, of which there have been hundreds, but all of the related creative industries too. No stages for bands to play on, no decks for DJs to play, no, live performance, and the arts really suffered through that period as well. And we're now in a period of building back, which is an incredibly hard task and takes a long period of time.
It's just so interesting. And as you say, it has been devastating how rules can change culture, and then how to recreate or create a new culture with different rules. How do you do that consciously? It seems like such a sort of amorphous thing, this idea of people gathering with feeling and spirit. Like, how do you sort of legislate for that?
Well, you can't legislate for it. That's the thing. And this is essentially what I argued in a piece that I wrote in Time Out in August, is that it might seem like we're worlds away from the lockout laws now, and we have achieved so much, but really all that law reform was the easy part. Like, changing the law settings, although it's been, a huge job, is actually the simple part of all of this. The hard, difficult part is rebuilding the culture again. Now we do have the right law settings. What's needed is for, operators and creatives and industry stakeholders who aren't in government to come to the table and present and formulate new things and see that creative destruction and work on things that don't work. And out of all of that sort of cauldron is going to come a new build back of Sydney, which I think will be better than what was there before. But it takes time, and it's not something that government should even be anywhere near. Government are terrible at creating culture. Every time they do in different places in the world, it just ends up being a fucking shit show. So, that's incumbent on us as operators to do, but it will take by far the most amount of time.
Well, it's a pretty brave endeavour that you're embarked upon. And I suppose, you've got this group. It's got a number of venues. So the Old Fitz, Odd Culture, the Duke of Enmore, Pleasure Club and I should also say, which I love, that you're, fiercely pokies free. And I love the way I've seen you describe pokies as a moral hazard. It's just like, tell it like it is. They are an absolute blight. But, I guess venues and governments are addicted to the revenue. But anyway, you're not playing that game. But, what do you do in your venues to try to build the Sydney that you want to live in?
I would say, part of it is that we've never been a particularly financially motivated company. We do things that we find interesting and cool, and then try and find a way of making it commercially viable after the fact, which may not be the best way to do this stuff, but it's the way that we've always done it, and we've always managed to find a way to make it work. So sort of like concept first, product first. And we're not alone in this. There's lots of other groups that do things this way, Sydney's a challenging market because we have a real estate sector that's overcooked. Our rents are, about maybe 60% higher than they are in Melbourne. for example. Spend per head's about the same, so you end up with just basically a larger cost on your profit and loss to wrangle with. And on the pub side of things, you have poker machine entitlements, which you just mentioned, are worth so much money to building owners, and venue operators are able to extract so much revenue out of gaming machines in New South Wales because I would say their operation is underregulated. So venue operators are able to, whereas before they might have had an annual revenue of a couple of $1 million on food and beverage, now they have this third profit centre that's popped up since the 1990s when they were allowed to put gaming machines into pubs in New South Wales, that sometimes at least challenges, in often cases it will usurp food and beverage in terms of revenue. And it's like, what sort of effect does that have culturally and also on food and beverage? Like, we know that gaming machines are terrible for the community, which is the moral argument that is generally accepted even here. Most people accept that gaming machines are harmful for the community and that the law settings should be stricter than they are on them. But, what happens in a business when food and beverage becomes secondary income streams to this other thing? Well, what happens is you end up with food and beverage menus, you end up with, product offerings that are designed to support that revenue stream. And that's what we see. I mean, I use the kind of flippant phrase like our pubs are shit in Sydney, which I operate 2 pubs in Sydney. I don't think that all of our pubs are shit. I just think that on balance, they're far less superior to the pub scene in, for example, Melbourne, who don't have this problem to the same degree that we do up here with gaming machines. Because what's happened up here is that gaming machines are so lucrative that all of the big groups have swooped in and consolidated a lot of the pubs in Sydney, given them, sort of beige whitewashed finishes, and set them up as throne rooms to a gaming room at the side or at the back, which, apart from being, I would say hugely immoral, is just boring. It just sucks. Like, it's not interesting in a way that you go to beautiful pubs in other parts of the world and it's like a whole experience.
So when you're sitting there at this summit in Birmingham, people are saying, oh, Sydney, like, we're just really looking to you for examples and answers, and you're sitting there thinking about beige throne rooms. I mean, what is it that they are loving?
I mean, a lot of it is the vibrancy reforms and the money that the government is spending in the space. So the government has funded a commissioner position for 24-hour economy, which is Michael Rodriguez, who is by far, in my estimation, one of the most effective bureaucrats who's ever worked in that government. He has managed to wrangle together a plethora of government departments, not just his own. I'm talking like police and health and all the stakeholders needed to get some of these law reforms over the line. He's gone out there and done it. Government's spending massive amounts of money trying to develop, organised communities so that, like, they can create the right settings for businesses to come out of the woodwork and create vibrant areas. It really is extraordinary, the amount of money that's being spent in this space and the amount of RAM that it takes up within our government. Like, they are very focused on this issue. And that's not, I think that Mike is the only night commissioner in the whole world. Like, there isn't another government position anywhere like that. It's pretty extraordinary. So when they look to us as a case study, it's more about how to get law reform that is effective in a small amount of time, because we've gone essentially from prohibition to decadence in about 4 years. It's been very quick. that we've managed to swing the pendulum all the way back to the other side. And I think that's what those stakeholders in other cities are looking to do, obviously, as well.
It's so interesting. So, I mean, yeah, and on the one hand, you're saying government should get out of the way of people working out how to have their own fun. But at the same time, of course, a regulatory environment, if it can squash something, hopefully it can also support it. So maybe this is an innovative enough position that it will be able to do something that government normally doesn't do. Yeah,
I think so. Like, government is supposed to deal with market failure, and so I would say, the proliferation of gaming machines in the community is a case of market failure. They should deal with that. They should legislate with that. What was done with the lockout laws was just it was too far, and it wasn't effective either. We know that it wasn't effective now. What it did manage to do was just kill a huge part of our economy and turn us into an international embarrassment on the nightlife stage.
So you mentioned real estate and rents, and I mean, you can get into any room in Sydney and talk about real estate, and that's going to be a conversation. But I'd love you to talk about it in terms of neighbourhoods, something that I'm so passionate about, and I know you are as well. Just this idea of a high street, a neighbourhood with its own character. What do you think the real estate market or landscape does to, I guess, promote or otherwise some of those streets in Sydney?
I mean, it's incredibly challenging, and as well as being, the CEO of my business and being on the 24-Hour Economy Advisory Council, I'm also the president of the business chamber for the Newtown and Enmore area in Sydney. And so we contend with this issue a lot because Newtown is one of these areas where everyone gives such a huge shit about what goes on here. Our locals have lived here for years. They're invested in what goes on. There's very active neighbourhood Facebook groups and things like that. Everyone really cares about everything that happens here. And an effect we've kind of seen, not just in the past few years, it's kind of always been the case, is the diversity of our businesses along our high street, which is King Street, which is an arterial road that connects the inner west essentially to the city. We get this situation come up where we kind of realise, we have 12 Thai restaurants on this street. And every 6 months, one of them will close and it will be vacant for a year. And then something happens and then another Thai restaurant will open in its place. And then 6 months later, that one or a different one will close and the same thing will happen. And every time this happens, of course, all of the community stakeholders are like, oh, why is this, what's going on here? Why is the government allowing this to happen? And the reality is, when you really look into it, the government has very limited control about what actually goes into a high street beyond the very, very coarse-grained control the council has to around permitted use on a street. So if you apply to council to put a beauty parlour in a neighbourhood that isn't allowed, they can refuse it. But they, in terms of a restaurant, which is under the planning legislation, a Class 6 premises. Class 6 premises can really be anything that is retail or food and beverage. So all of this is just to say council can't actually say, no, we don't want a Thai restaurant here. They have to just go with whatever the tenant wants. They'll put an application, or maybe they won't. Sometimes they don't need to even put an application in to open a new place. So then it becomes, well, who's deciding what tenants go into this space? And at the bottom of it, it turns out that it's really up to private landlords. And in the piece that you're referencing in Time Out last year, I kind of I put it this way, saying like at bottom, it's private real estate agents and overseas landlords that are our culture curators on our high streets, because the real estate agents are the ones who decide who goes into a commercial premises, like in concert with the landlords. And in Sydney, our property market's so blue chip that most of the world has its money parked here. You wouldn't realise, but the level of foreign investment and ownership in commercial property is staggering here, which creates a disconnect between ownership and end use. Like, a lot of these landlords don't really give a shit what goes on in their premises as long as they get paid. Some of them are so, wealthy and the buildings are worth so much that they don't actually really care if there's a tenant inside them or not. They just want to hold on to them, which obviously puts an even further upward pressure on rents, which are too high in Sydney as it is.
Yeah. Well, I mean, do you have any ideas on how to solve this one? Because, I don't imagine anytime soon there's going to be, the class 6 is going to be divided up into cuisines, and when there's too many ties, someone has to do something else.
Yeah, touching like on what we were saying just before, nor should the government have their hand in this pot, I don't think. Like, the government shouldn't be curating the culture on that level either. But what is needed is, like, again, just with the lockout discussion, what's needed is the right settings for good creative business owners to come out of the woodwork and go, hey, I'm going to give this a crack. And what's required there is a good regulatory environment. So you shouldn't need to worry about being closed down by the police or by a complaining neighbour all the time. But also just the financials of the thing. You need to be able to afford to run your neighbourhood bistro or your cafe or whatever. And yeah, the tenor of that piece in Time Out was basically saying that at the moment it just comes down to a question of who has the deepest pockets and will they be able to continue paying this really high rent when they go broke, which is the presumption that a lot of real estate agents I've spoken to will, if they're honest, they will say this to me. They're like, we know hospitality is a high risk industry. We know that these shops are going to fail. So the question isn't about who's going to do the best thing, really. It's about who can pay the most rent and who has the deepest pockets, so that when their restaurant closes, we can keep collecting from them until we find someone else, which is just really sad, I think.
Well, it's really sad. It's really cynical, but it's also very wasteful, and I guess throws people into insecure employment and has all kinds of up and downstream negative impacts. But again, it's just also a massive ship to turn around. Because when you're talking about the right settings, you're talking about, the whole economy and perhaps capitalism in general.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty big one.
A discussion for another time.
Well, I don't know. Like, if you've got any answers, like, let's hear them. But I mean, because I love the way that you've got these venues and this culture that you're curating, room by room, but then you've also got these quite big picture roles that you play, on the street and in the broader industry across the city. What do you see as your overall project?
It's got to be building back something better in Sydney than what we had before. Like, that's what it has to be. And I don't know if that, I think that that's likely to happen. I think it's difficult and I think it's impossible to predict what will happen, because what we're talking about really there is thousands of operators, business owners, young people having a crack, old established operators opening new things, trying new things, and then hopefully the whole mess of it is just something that has a vibe to it. I know that anything has to be better than what we've had for the past 10 years. But that's got to be the project.
I love the project. And the word vibrancy, when it's used in this sort of, official sense, does have a kind of ick to it. But in its good in its good sense. Like, you know, if you had the Sydney of your dreams, like what would it feel like? What would be happening there?
I mean, I use the phrase like a high street should be a authentic kaleidoscope of the community who live there. So people don't like. We need less international chains and more authentic expressions of community, basically. And that's what people resonate with. Like that's when you walk down a high street and you see Starbucks and a frozen yogurt place and blah, 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 you don't go like, oh, this is a cool neighborhood. You go, I'm in fucking Darling Harbour or something right now, you know. The cool neighborhoods are the ones where by some, you know, happenstance or some curation maybe, you have, you know, beautiful neighborhoods that just have developed in a way that there aren't 14 chicken shops in a row, no butchers and no grocers like there are in Newtown. You know, like how the fuck did that happen? We've ended up with, like, you can't live in Newtown and have access to everything that you need because there are categories missing, but then there's an oversupply of so many others. Yeah.
You can have anything you want so long as it's hot chicken.
Yeah, you can have chicken and Thai food, and about 15 pubs, but we have no butcher. You know, it's like it's beyond belief sometimes when I look at it, but realistically, as you say, incredibly hard problem to solve because you can't there's no one lever that you can pull to fix that. You know?
Yeah. Well, I reckon you got your hands on a few levers, so I definitely congratulate you for that, James. I want to shift gears a little bit. We were in touch recently because I'm writing a story for Good Food celebrating the culture change champions that we gave this inaugural award to last year in both Melbourne and Sydney. And you've been involved with Women and Revolution. With Bridget Raphael was the founder of that organisation in New South Wales. So I guess what the topic now is, you know, culture in hospitality, what you think is happening in that space. It's obviously been a pretty huge year for these discussions. How does it all sit with you?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a huge year and obviously our industry's had a bit of a reckoning, which in many ways was a long time coming. You know, I'm not a woman. But I did experience really, really horrible conditions in my early career in this industry in Sydney, and I resonate with some of the stories that have been told in that space, and obviously. The whole industry, at least the people who I speak to, are just the conversation's just been about like how do we do better, how do we upskill smaller operators and professionalise the industry more than it is. We have worked closely or somewhat closely with Women in Revolution because we're big believers in listening to female and non-binary voices. Our business has always been that way. And queer voices, I should say. I think it's been a period of listening and learning, and they are just some of the most unbelievable human beings that I've ever met, and they have so much wisdom. That's kind of been our involvement with them is like how do we do better by our people? How do we do better? How do we build a better industry? It's not always a conversation that needs like a male voice like mine. So, you know, it's just mostly about listening and learning.
What kinds of things have you learnt from, like committing to that inclusion and diversity of voices?
It's always like, I think as human beings, we have a proclivity to like project our own experience onto the world. And it's really sobering to hear other people and their experiences that are different to yours on a regular basis, because I think, like myself as a human, I have a proclivity to like slip back into that as well and be like, oh, well, I think I understand the world and how it is. And it's just about having voices at the table. Like I said to you the other day, you know, if diverse voices aren't actually at your table, like if you consult with diverse voices and listen to what they say, that's one thing. But actually having people from diverse backgrounds at the decision-making table is what makes the difference. So just having blinkers on a little bit more in that sense, like what is the makeup of our teams? What's the makeup of our boards? How can we make sure that we're hearing all voices in a way that's like impactful and meaningful? But also, so something that really struck me with what WAR do is this piece about like advocating for yourself. So a really banal example of that is like how to negotiate a pay rise. So I'm in senior management in hospitality. I see these interactions happen all the time. On the whole, people are quite bad at advocating for themselves when it comes to like their pay and their, you know, what that's going to be. Women and queer and non-binary people, even more so, really like generally quite bad at feeling empowered and confident to go, this is what I want. This is what I think I'm worth. And so WAR run seminars on how to do that. And obviously that confidence piece, you know, speaks to more than just salary and conditions. It speaks to your boundaries, your internal boundaries, your external boundaries, how you're willing to be treated, what you're willing to accept in the workplace, and advocating for yourself, which I think speaks to a lot of what has sort of come up in this conversation in the past 6 months. I think it's really important work to do. It might sound backwards for a business to be training their staff on how to advocate for a pay rise, but like I think it's it's connected to everything else.
Yeah, I think that sort of those skills, and as you say, that setting of boundaries and valuing yourself, in one arena is going to spill over into others, and just give you some of the tools and the language to find that strength in the moment. So I totally understand what you're saying there. I also imagine that when you've got people who do have that voice, that it's good for business as well.
Yeah, well, and confidence doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get what you want, you know? Like, it's just about having a robust and it's about having a good faith discussion, right? Like, just speaking about pay specifically, you know? We want people to confidently ask for what they want. They're not always necessarily, that's not always going to be possible, but we will, we'll have a good faith discussion and explain what the reasoning is and what's going on. That is better in my mind than someone just being like, oh, okay, yep. And then being unhappy with the salary that they've agreed to, you know. Obviously, the salary part of it is sort of tokenistic to a lot of other things in this discussion, but it's kind of a really tangible example you can give, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, obviously money's important. Like, we are in the end working for money. We just want to have, all the good culture around it to support us as humans and members of an economy, hopefully a vibrant one.
Yeah, hopefully.
James, really great to chat to you. Next time I come to Sydney and I come to one of your venues, which one will I choose and what will I enjoy when I get there?
Well, we actually own 4 that are in walking distance from each other. So I would be recommending a walking tour beginning at Bistro Grenier, which is our French bistro, down into Odd Culture, wine bar, up to Spawn, which is a drink-in bottle shop for a quick one, and then down to Pleasure Club, which is our cocktail bar and late-night live music venue for a few late-night Negronis, probably, would be my
Yeah, well, locked in, not locked out. That sounds really fun. I'll book myself in. Thank you so much for chatting. I feel like we've covered a lot of stuff, basically solved all of Sydney's problems in half an hour. So nice one. Thanks for doing what you're doing, and appreciate your time and having a chat.
Thanks, Dani. Great to speak to you.
This is Dirty Linen, and I'm Dani Valent. We air the issues that the hospitality industry finds hard to talk about, hearing from different people with unique perspectives. We want to hear from you as well. If you have something that needs to be said about a topic, get in touch so we can include your perspective. Contact us at dirtyLinen@deepintheweeds.com.au or hit us up on Insta at Dirty Linen Podcast. We can't wait to hear from you.
This is a Deep in the Weeds production.